And I'm going to create another standard 640 by 480, ActionScript 3.0, hit create. And I'm going to name this one file save as, or save, IK. So this is inverse kinematics. So for inverse kinematics, we don't need parenting view on. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to go back to my skeleton, and I'm going to copy the same bits of skeleton that we had before. Just copy those from there, and just paste them in here. There we go. Let's move them down again, kind of towards the edge here. And you know what? I am going to change my background because it looks very white. It is very white. Stage color. Let's create very green. Let's use green. All right. So here is my skeleton. So for inverse kinematics are going to be a bit different, as mentioned. But the way we're going to do it is we need to use a specific tool that is not going to appear by default. And that's the bone tool. So to summon the bone tool, what you have to do is edit your toolbar. So the little ellipse down at the bottom here. And you'll find the bone tool right here. And we can pull that out and add it to our toolbar. Hit escape to close that out. So with the bone tool selected, now the bone tool works by click dragging to create bones across either a set of symbol instances like we have here. Remember, they're all graphic symbol instances. Or you can actually use them inside of a shape as well. So you can create an inverse kinematics armature as part of a shape too. But we're going to deal with bones here, and we're going to deal with movie clip symbol instances or graphic symbol instances. So the way you use the bone tool is you have to establish first your root bone. And it's really important to think about where the root bone should be, right? So if you're looking at like a human form like this, a human skeleton, like where does everything branch out from, right? In a human skeleton. The skull, the arms, legs, everything. Kind of like the center, right? Like the heart area. Pelvis, yeah, you could use the pelvis. That would work too, actually. And we could do the pelvis. Maybe we'll do the pelvis. I usually start from the heart. Even though it's a skeleton, he doesn't have a heart anymore. But yeah, you could absolutely use the pelvis. Let's use the pelvis. So if I click and drag from the pelvis, notice what happens. I get my root bone, which the root is shown as a white block, right? With a red kind of thing around it. And then this is telling me as I'm dragging it, oh, you know what? I didn't click the pelvis there. It got angry. So another thing to worry about when it comes to IK is the actual like structure of your content. So before I click on the pelvis, I'm going to right click on it and I want to arrange and bring to front. That's going to make sure that when I create this bone on the pelvis, it's going to create it on the pelvis. What happened is it was actually creating it on the rib cage that last time. So I'm going to select my bone tool again with the pelvis arranged to the front. And I'm going to click right here. There we go. That establishes that root bone. Then I'm going to pull it up to the chest area and release. Now, again, I set my snapping settings so that snapping is always on with new documents. So I want to stop that. I want to go to View, Snapping, Edit Snapping, and turn all that snapping off. Okay, there we go. So we have our initial bone right here. It goes from the pelvis. The pelvis is connected to the rib cage. Now, if you look right here, Armature 1 is created. Armature 1 is given a little special figure right, icon for our layer, because an armature layer is a special layer type inside of Animate when you're dealing with IK rigging. So inverse kinematics gets its own special armature layer, and everything that's part of that layer, that's part of that armature, becomes part of that special armature layer, right? So you can see there's still a bunch of stuff inside of layer 1, but we're gonna kind of consume all of that stuff into our armature layer as we finish building out this IK armature. So what we do to establish additional pieces to our rig is we have to click on that joint right there, and then we can pull out to figure out where we want to go ahead and establish more bones. There we go. Now the head's connected. Skull. We're going to pull this out here to the shoulder. Pull that out to the elbow. Pull that out to the wrist. And there we go. We're going to do the same thing to the other side. And wrist. Oop, didn't quite get the wrist there. Let's try again. Nope. There we go. Yeah, so this is where like stacking order of your in your layer really matters. And again, you can always change the stacking order if you need to by just right-clicking on an object and choosing a range and bring it forward, bring it back, send it back, that sort of thing. So if you look here, check that out. We got armature 1, and the other layer has completely disappeared, right? So there he is. How do we actually manipulate an armature once we've created it with the bone tool? All we do is we click on it and move it around. So you can see his arm is wildly moving around, right? And it's moving about in a very strange way. It's actually been disconnected from the rib cage, right? So I'm going to do a Command-Control-Z. And check it out. We can actually use the selection tools to select individual bones. A selected bone shows up as green. And we can look over in our object properties and we can see that it's an IK bone we have selected. And we've got a bunch of different properties for our bones. So, like I said, this is the oldest version of rigging inside of Animate, and it's probably the most complicated version of rigging there is. So you have the ability to control things like the location of the joints, the joint rotation, translation, across X and Y, spring, right? Things like that. So residual motion based on physics. It's very complicated. But what we want to do here is for this bone right here and this bone over here, we want to disable joint rotation. So I'm going to toggle that off for both of these bones that are on the shoulders. All right, there we go. And they share the same joint right here, the heart, so we don't have to do it to both. So now if I go ahead and move this, you can see it no longer moves from there. You can also tell it's very different from FK, because with FK, right? With FK, what I need to do, I need to use the free transform tool, and basically you can see how very sort of robotic and linear this movement is, right? It's very precise though. When it comes to IK, you can see that not only do the child bones in the rig respond to my movements, but the parent bones respond to it as well. So this is why it's inverse kinematics, right? It all responds physically based on the bone structure and the different properties you give to each bone. So for instance, right now, I can move this bone all around. You can be like, woo, which isn't very realistic. If you actually did that, it would really hurt, right? So I see it won't let you connect the right wrist. So yeah, that's one of those issues where you probably, what you want to do is select the right wrist I guess that's the right wrist, and right click upon it and say arrange, bring to front, and that should make it easier for you to connect that final bone. Because what happens is with IK, as you're building the bone structure, like if you've got like this object and it's overlaying this object here, you know, it's going to want to connect to this object and it's going to block everything under it. But if you arrange to the top, what happens is it'll be on the top, it'll be much easier to target. Yeah, perfect. Great. Yeah, that's usually what the problem is with IK. Oh, the layer did not disappear after you made your bones. Is there anything inside the layer? Like, is it an empty keyframe or is it a filled keyframe that's being displayed? You might have missed a bone. It doesn't really matter that much. Like, if the layer sticks around, in previous versions of Animate, it would never actually remove the old layer. So if you're using an older version of Animate, maybe that's what's happening. And even with newer versions of Animate, I noticed like it takes like 30 to 40 seconds after your armature is complete before it removes that empty layer. So, you know, it's not going to hurt anything being there. You could always delete it yourself if you want. Yeah. So the rotation tool for IK, you just want to use the selection tool. Just like that. Yeah. So, you know, both of them are very similar in some ways, but also very different. So another difference, I mean, you can see right here in our timeline, right? The entire armature is within an armature layer. It's one specific object. So it absolutely keeps your timeline much neater if you're using IK. Yeah, I mean, you should be able to just grab it. See, I got my selection tool. You just kind of like grab any of the bones, and it can really be any bone, right? And it just sort of like, they all respond because they're all in this like he can do this groovy snake thing. Ooh. You know, stuff like that. Okay, cool, you got it. Perfect. Yeah. No, IK is really cool. And like I said, it's the oldest type of rigging inside of Animate, but it's really, really powerful how it's set up and how things respond to one another. So how do you actually animate stuff like this, right? So once you have your rig created, it's very similar to what we looked at earlier today with motion tweens and motion layers. You may have gathered motion tweens create their own motion layer, which is special, right? You can probably tell by, if I zoom in here a little bit, we've got the little diamond keyframe that shows up in our armature layer. So armature layers work very similar to how motion tweens work, right? So if I go to like frame 15, let's go ahead and add in, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Add in a bunch of frames, right? You can see an armature layer has a green background for the frames. And it works just like motion tweens, where you just go out a little bit and you're like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, do something like this, and a keyframe is automatically inserted. Then you can move over a little bit more, And notice because this is IK, like everything's kind of moving all at once. You can see like the rest of the bones around here move as well. And then we'll go to the end and have this guy just put his arm down, right? And then we play it back. Ooh, that goes really fast, huh? He's a spastic little skeleton. So what these are called, they're actually not called keyframes when it comes to these keyframes. They're actually called poses inside of Animate when it comes to IK. So each one of these is a pose, which means that if you go in here and you say like right click, notice here, because we're dealing with an armature layer, we can insert poses, we can clear poses. And if we insert a pose, we get a little keyframe, right? So it's just different terminology specific to the armature layer. Yeah. That goes way too fast. Goodness. So what happens, right? What happens when things go too fast? What can we do about that? What we can do is we can go ahead, if we double click on our span right here, notice we get that little yellow thingamajig again, the little yellow line. And if we hover over it, we get that double-headed arrow. That allows us to extend. So we could extend to like 1 second here. And what it does is it stretches everything out. And then there we go. Pretty good. Maybe we could even do that a little more. So again, double click, selects the entire span. Got that little yellow guy, double-headed arrow. Just drag it out. All right, that's a little too slow. So double-headed arrow, pull it back, guys. Somewhere around there. It's pretty good. And of course, you know, parts of him aren't moving, right? Because everything that's connected to here is moving, and I moved the skull. But other parts aren't moving so well. But that's okay, because we can always just shift things around here and there. Now he's got a little wiggle. We could do the same thing to his torso. Yeah, turned out a little weird, but that's okay. You get the idea. He's shaky. He's a skeleton, you know. How can you not be shaky, right? So again, let's go ahead and publish this guy. Animate a GIF, publish.